People talk about the Grateful Dead in a lot of different ways. And if you're not a big fan of theirs, what you may or may not know about them probably depends on the context in which you heard about them. Some people talk about the Grateful Dead in terms of the counterculture that grew up in San Francisco in the 1960s. Some people talk about the Grateful Dead in terms of the toll that drugs and alcohol and an unhealthy lifestyle took on the band. They've also been talked about in terms of improvisation. People talk about it in terms of their attempts to find an economic model free of corporate interference, which was a very big part of their ethos. Some people might talk about them in terms of the folk music revival of the late 60s, early 70s. Some people may talk about it in terms of their ability to gather together all different types of American music into one big melting pot. In terms of that they could often not be a very good band in the things that people kind of expect from a band. They played out of tune. They could have long breaks between songs that would spoil the momentum of a show. Some nights they were off, some nights they were on. What I want to talk about today is the Grateful Dead and their relationship to experimental music. They're one of those bands with a lot of strong personalities, and each of them came from a different background. The de facto leader of the band, Jerry Garcia, the guitarist, came out of a folk music and bluegrass background, though he was also interested in a broad range of music. Phil Lesh, the bass player, didn't even play bass until he joined the Grateful Dead. He came from studying the modern European tradition of experimental music, the experimental post-war music. He had been studying that. There was jazz influences. One of the drummers, Mickey Hart, had a lot of interest in exploring music or percussion and rhythm and drums from all over the world, incorporating North Indian drumming, Moroccan drumming, Egyptian drumming into his work. And later on, he began to explore electronics. So all of these different factors came together into a band that morphed a lot over the years. 68 Grateful Dead was very different from 72 Grateful Dead, was very different from 78 Grateful Dead. And one of the reasons they were able to grow and morph so often is their interest in exploration and experimentation. So what I would like to do today is talk about the Grateful Dead in terms of experimental music. And I would like to begin by giving just suggestions of 4 albums of studio recordings that the Grateful Dead participated in that will highlight their contribution and their interest in experimental music. The first one I want to mention is the second studio album, Anthem of the Sun. The first studio album, I don't think the Grateful Dead had really found their sound yet. They hadn't found their second drummer yet. I'm not even sure that their lyricist Robert Hunter had joined the band yet. But by the time they went into the studio for the second time to record Anthem of the Sun, they were very, very clear-eyed about what they wanted to do. I'm not saying they were unique in this in terms of rock bands in the 1960s, but they wanted to use the studio as an instrument, the studio as the art form. And they came with a lot of great ideas that created a really weird and interesting album. They had just finished a live tour where they did multi-track recordings of the tour in order to incorporate live music into the studio music. So this album is a combination of live tracks, recorded tracks, prepared piano, weird noises, weird effects. They just wanted to explore what you could do in the studio as an art form separate from live performance. And if you just want to listen to one track, An Anthem of the Sun, listen to the first one. It's really amazing how much that 7 or 8 minutes of what became known as the other one really encapsulates so much of what they would continue to explore over the years. It begins with this kind of very weird faux British ballad, old folky British ballad, morphs into these live recordings of a really hard-pounding double drums, really loud guitar, rolling 6/8 rhythm of the other one, and then devolves into this experimental sound sculpture space. Yeah, if you just want to listen to one thing, that 7 or 8 minutes really encapsulates of what they would be doing. And the rest of the album is really great too, and really captures them better than most of their studio albums do. The second thing I want to talk about is they did some collaborations with this experimental musician Ned Legion. When he first met the Grateful Dead, he was on the East Coast studying music and studying computers. And this would have been like in the late 60s, early 70s. So he was really a pioneer in incorporating computers into music. And the Grateful Dead fell in love with the stuff he was doing and wanted to support his work. So they brought him out into San Francisco. They didn't bring him out to San Francisco. He saw an opportunity to find musicians to play with and to find like-minded experimental musicians. So he went out to San Francisco, played with the Grateful Dead off and on in concerts, but was also interested in developing his own work. And he produced an album in the mid-70s called Seastones, and it really is a visionary album. He was a pioneer in, like I said, he was a pioneer in trying to incorporate computers into music, and he had all this homemade equipment because computers were not doing what he wanted them to do. So he would do things where he would use one instrument to modulate another instrument. So you might have the attack and sustain and decay of Jerry's guitar playing, but processed through a different instrument. Or maybe having another instrument modulate his playing. Stuff that it's only in recent times that anybody can do that kind of stuff at home on their computers. In fact, his thinking was so ahead of his time that he released a version of this album, Seastones, in 1975, but he continued to work on it over the years. And from what he says, it was only in the last 10 years or so that Pro Tools could finally do what he wanted it to do so he could finish the piece. So he's been working on this piece for many, many years, and he's released a version on his website that you can find, which is much longer than the original version. And it's really, really interesting. It's really, really fascinating stuff. And the album has members of the Grateful Dead playing on it, which is why I wanted to bring this up. That Phil Lesh plays on it, Mickey Hart plays on it, Jerry Garcia plays on it. It's not a Grateful Dead album, but it's music that they were happy to explore and 100% into exploring. They did some live gigs, especially Mickey and Jerry and Ned Legion did some live gigs in San Francisco at the Palace of Fine Arts. Phil Lesh, the bass player, and Ned Legion would do this set that they call Seastones in between Grateful Dead sets, and that stuff was ahead of its time. It was harsh, it was loud, it was almost industrial. Some of the fans loved it, some of the fans didn't know what to make of it. So again, it's not Grateful Dead music, but it's music that they were supporting and involved in and helping nurture and bring to life. Third example of the Grateful Dead doing experimental music is this album that Mickey Hart did with other members of the Grateful Dead. I think it's called the Rhythm Devils, the Apocalypse Now session, something like that. And the origin of that album is this. Francis Ford Coppola saw the Grateful Dead while he was working on Apocalypse Now and loved what the drummers were doing and invited them to create music for Apocalypse Now. So Mickey Hart ran with the idea. He set up in their studio up in San Rafael. He set up this room full of all kinds of percussion instruments from around the world, handmade stuff, traditional stuff, electronic stuff. There was this instrument this electronic instrument called the bean that had these long, low piano strings that you could play with mallets or scrape or play with your fingers. And so he just set up this instrument, invited his friends to come in and just improvise music while watching rough edits of Apocalypse Now. So again, Phil Lesh was involved in this, the other drummer in the band, Bill Kreutzmann, were involved in this. Plus he brought in other musicians too, like Airto, a famous percussionist, I think from Brazil, was involved with it. I think his wife, Flora Purim, was also involved in it. And just amazing. It really is astounding. Francis Ford Coppola wound up not using very much of that music in the final movie, but this album is just a really amazing and quite stunning early example of world music. Really stunning example of the Grateful Dead exploring experimental music. Every Grateful Dead concert in the second half of their career, in the middle of the second set was this section called Drum Space, which was where they would take the spirit of their improvisation and exploratory music, and they would take a 15 to 30 minute part of the set where they would just improvise. The music could go anywhere. And that would be where they would do most of their really exploratory and experimental music. There have been attempts to put that on an album to try to present that part of them. There was an album that the Grateful Dead put out. It was actually the last album they put out while Jerry was still alive, while they were still a real band, called Infrared Roses, which is a compilation of drums in space from various shows from I think the 89 and 90 tours. And that, to me, I don't think is that successful. I feel like it's hard to find a way out of the context of the concerts to make that drum space stuff meaningful. And I feel like they didn't quite accomplish it there. Personally, I think it's too long. It's about 60 minutes long. And I feel like if they'd been able to cut like 15 or 20 minutes out of it, it would have been a really concise, much stronger presentation of that part of them. But much more successful than that was this album called Gray Folded, which they commissioned from this artist named John Oswald. And John Oswald does this thing he called plunderphonics, where he takes pre-existing music, samples it, and just plays with it. He doubles it, reverses it, repeats it, layers it over each other, just creates this collage of music based on pre-existing music. He got in trouble in the years before this commission doing music by Michael Jackson, by the band U2, but the Grateful Dead commissioned him to take all of the versions of Dark Star that they played over the course of their 30-year career and create an album. And it is astounding. Dark Star was famously the song that they first used to open up to really exploratory and experimental areas. So the idea was he would just take every Dark Star ever recorded and do his plunderphonics to it. And that is a double CD. It's 2 hours of music. So even though it's twice as long as that Infrared Roses, John Oswald knows what he's doing. John Oswald was able to take that part of the Grateful Dead and present it on a recording, on a CD that really makes it shine and makes it work. So again, it's not the Grateful Dead. It's kind of John Oswald playing the Grateful Dead. I think it's probably the best introduction to the experimental side of the Grateful Dead. If you like experimental music, if you like music that explores new territory, this is the best way to show one of the things that the Grateful Dead did really well. He takes versions of Dark Star from when they first played in 67 to when they last played it in 95. doubles them, repeats them, reverses them, stretches them out long, brings them in fast, puts 100 versions of vocals all in at the same time. And the amazing thing that even though it's actually 2 full CDs of music, I think each CD is over an hour a piece, maybe about an hour a piece, John Oswald found the way to create a context to make it work as a recording in a way that Infrared Roses didn't. So if you're interested in checking out the Grateful Dead as experimental musicians, I think those 4 albums are really great places to start. Anthem of the Sun, their second studio album, Sea Stones by Ned Legion, the Apocalypse Now rhythm sections, and this Gray Folded by John Oswald and the Grateful Dead.